I stood in the bridal suite of Linden Garden House, holding my breath. The late May sun slanted through the stained glass window, painting golden streaks across the floor. My dress hung by the mirror, exactly where I'd left it. Except something looked off. Too still. Too flat. I stepped closer. Elise stopped mid-sip of her tea. "Caro, what happened to the side?" There it was. A long, clean slash down the seam, from hip to hem. Deliberate. Surgical. The embroidery, done by hand by Ms. Dina from Fulton Street, gaped open like a wound. My throat tightened, and then I heard it. A soft, steady tapping. Nail file against thumbnail. I turned. Evelyn stood near the window. Her posture regal, pearls glinting. "You didn't take my advice," she said, her voice calm like iced tea. So I helped. For a moment. The silence in the room was louder than any scream. "You cut my dress." "I adjusted your decision," she replied. "It wasn't right for the Brooks family." Too plain. My hands shook, but not from panic. Something deeper settled in my chest. This woman had tried to erase me with a seam ripper. But I wasn't 22 anymore. I wasn't quiet, desperate, or unsure of who I was. I reached for my phone on the side table. Elise whispered, "Caroline, what are you?" I tapped the screen. The livestream was still rolling. For the last 35 minutes, our grant team had been broadcasting behind the scenes footage as part of our nonprofit's community storytelling pilot. The guests, our friends, donors, even local partners, were watching, including Evelyn's Bridge Club. I stepped closer, turned the phone toward her, and let the camera linger. She paled. "You wouldn't," she said, voice sharp now. "Not over a dress." I looked down at the fabric, then back at her. It was never just a dress. If your future mother-in-law cut your wedding dress minutes before the ceremony, would you still walk down the aisle, or walk away? The morning light filtered into my apartment like it always did. Soft, golden, gentle. The windows were cracked just enough to let in the hum of the city waking up. Somewhere below, a delivery truck beeped in reverse. Birds hopped along the railing of my balcony, pecking at crumbs I'd left the morning before. I wrapped my robe tighter around me and stared at the bouquet Elise had brought in. White peonies and dusty pink garden roses tied with linen. The kind I'd picked from a catalog 3 months ago. With trembling fingers, not quite trusting that this day would arrive. "I brought extra honey," Elise said from the kitchen. "You always forget how dry toast is without it." Her voice was light, but I caught the way her eyes lingered on me. She'd seen me unravel before. At the end of my first marriage, during the layoff scare at the foundation, when my mother's cancer came back. She knew the signs. The way my fingers tapped without rhythm. How I barely touched the banana on the plate in front of me. Still, she didn't press. Just passed me a warm slice of toast and kept humming something soft from Sarah McLachlan. The tea was mint and chamomile. Mark's blend. He'd left it at my door in a thermos marked "Bride Fuel." And a little sticky note, "You're everything. See you at the arbor." I held it in my palm longer than necessary, heat soaking into my skin. Something about his steadiness grounded me, even when I couldn't trust my own breath. I didn't know then that peace could feel so fragile. 2 weeks earlier, I stood inside Ms. Dina's boutique on Fulton Street, tucked between a consignment bookstore and a bakery that always smelled like burnt sugar and cinnamon. The boutique wasn't grand. No chandeliers, no champagne flutes. But it was filled with story. Fabrics draped across mannequins. Soft jazz playing from a dusty speaker. The smell of lavender starch in the air. Ms. Dina worked with her hands like a sculptor. Every pin she placed had purpose. Every stitch told a truth. "This dress has hips," she teased, smoothing the crepe over my waist. She's not shy. I laughed. She's 42 and tired of apologizing. You wear it like a woman who rebuilt herself, she said. Stepping back, I looked in the mirror. The sleeves were delicate, embroidered with vines and thread-drawn petals. The train brushed the floor with just enough grace. It wasn't trendy, and I didn't care. It felt like something my grandmother would have sewn if she'd lived long enough to meet Mark. I'd told Evelyn about the boutique weeks prior. She'd raised an eyebrow. A local shop. Caroline, there's a couture house in D.C. I have a contact. I smiled politely, declined. When I sent her a photo from the fitting, she replied in under a minute. Simple. But I suppose it's sincere. I remember staring at those words longer than I should have, feeling the compliment twist inside them like a hidden blade. The engagement dinner was held at the Jefferson, all white tablecloths and waiters in gloves. Mark had reserved the private room upstairs, thinking it would be intimate. But Evelyn arrived early and rearranged the seating cards. She placed herself between the two wealthiest guests, moving Elise to the far corner. When I arrived, my nameplate had been shifted beside her. I thought it would be nice, she said with a smile, her pearls catching the light. So we could bond. During the toast, she stood with effortless poise. To Caroline, she said, lifting her glass, whose tireless work for the community reminds us all that true value isn't always monetary. There was polite laughter. A few guests smiled uncertainly. I forced a nod. Mark didn't say much that night. He held my hand under the table, his thumb tracing small circles, like he was apologizing for something he couldn't name. After dessert, Evelyn leaned over. Will there be valet parking at the venue? Some of our friends drive vintage. I stared at her. It's a garden ceremony. She blinked slowly. Saw flats and fans. Then, her smile didn't waver, but I saw it for what it was. A warning cloaked in etiquette. That night, in my apartment, I peeled off the silk blouse I'd bought just for the dinner and folded it back into its bag. I didn't cry. But I didn't sleep either. The rehearsal was meant to be short and light-hearted. We arrived at Linden Garden House just after 4 p.m. The late spring sun made everything glow. Honeysuckle on the trellis, bees lazy in the lavender. But inside, Evelyn had already taken control. She was instructing the coordinator where to place the floral arch. The left side is more photogenic, she insisted, ignoring the plan Mark and I approved weeks ago. She corrected the flower girl's walk. Asked if Elise could smile less wide during photos. When I mentioned we were using a playlist for the ceremony, not live musicians, she pressed her lips together like I'd offered canned soup at a gala. Later, she pulled me aside as the others milled around the cocktail table. You're doing well, she said. I know all this attention is new, but try not to overdo the eye makeup. It settles in fine lines. It wasn't cruel. That was the problem. It was precise. Clean. Designed to cut without leaving a mark. That night, back at the Airbnb, I sat on the edge of the bed and read old journal entries. One line from 2 months earlier caught my eye. If I'm not careful, I'll shrink again just to fit. I closed the notebook. And I promised myself I wouldn't. The morning of the wedding, I woke before the sun. The Airbnb was quiet, except for the distant chirp of birds and the occasional creak of the old hardwood floor beneath my steps. I moved slowly. Made tea, reread Mark's note, laid out the earrings my mother once wore to her own wedding. Elise arrived just after 8 with her overnight bag and a grocery sack full of breakfast supplies. She brought scones, yogurt, oranges, and a flask of ginger tea she swore by. You need protein, she said, pointing to the hard, boiled eggs like a nurse. And no crying today. I smiled. I'll try. We dressed in silence. Comfortable, familiar. Like sisters in an old routine. The dress hung by the closet, the sunlight catching on the delicate embroidery. I ran my hand down the sleeve, breathing in the lavender sachet I'd tucked into the garment bag days ago. It smelled like intention. Like care. I thought of everything this dress had come to mean. Not just a garment, but proof that I had chosen something. Created something, that I hadn't settled. I turned to the mirror. Gardenia lotion on my wrists. Hair pinned, not too tight. Bare lips, just enough blush. For a moment, I saw her, the version of me I used to chase. Whole, quiet, strong. And for that moment, I believed I could stay her. After Elise stepped out to take a call, I sat at the vanity and opened my journal. The leather was worn, pages soft from use. I turned to the last entry. The one I'd written the night before. If she tries something tomorrow, remember who you are. You don't need her blessing. You never did. I added one more line, slowly, carefully. Walk in as yourself. Leave as no one else's version. The pen felt heavy in my hand. A breeze drifted in through the open window, carrying the scent of honeysuckle and fresh mulch from the garden below. I thought back to the night Mark proposed. It wasn't grand. No staged photos. No choreographed moment. Just us on the back porch after dinner. Fireflies blinking in the trees. He held out a simple silver ring and said, I don't want someone to complete me. I want someone to remind me who I already am. That was the first time I believed love could feel like peace. This morning, I needed that memory more than ever. Because, even as the sun filled the room and Elise returned with fresh curls and a bright smile, I felt the edge of something I couldn't name. Not dread, not fear, but a knowing that the hardest part of this day hadn't even started yet. The moment we stepped out of the shuttle van and into the garden courtyard, I felt something was off. The arbor was still there, draped in blush silk and eucalyptus, just as I'd envisioned. The folding chairs were lined up in neat rows, the aisles scattered with dried lavender and rose petals from Elise's studio. But the seating chart, the calligraphy board we'd commissioned, was gone. In its place stood a white vinyl printout mounted in a gilded frame. Glossy, generic, wrong. My heart dropped. Elise leaned in. Wait! That's not yours, is it? I walked closer, scanning the names. My entire team from the foundation. People who'd worked with me for 6 years. Had been moved to the far back, past the extended family section. My college roommates were gone. In their place were names I didn't recognize. A quick glance at Evelyn's Bridge Club roster would probably match all 5. Elise. I whispered. The program's wrong. She nodded, and the place cards on the head table. Evelyn switched them. I watched her do it an hour ago. I felt my jaw tighten. Not rage. Not yet. Just that first icy wave, like the ocean pulling back before it crashes. Before I could speak, the coordinator approached. Miss Whitmore, she said carefully. Mrs. Brooks asked us to streamline the guest flow for clarity. I blinked. By erasing people, she fumbled. We still have the original file. I can. No, I said. Leave it, for now. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. Because in that moment I knew, this wasn't about clarity. It was about control. Inside the main hall, the soft string music drifted overhead, mingling with the faint scent of eucalyptus and lemon polish. It should have felt like celebration. But as I walked toward the welcome alcove, something else hit me. The table, my table, was missing. Gone were the hand-framed photos of my parents, the one of my mother in her 1970s tea-length wedding dress, smiling wide under a veil she'd sewn herself. The memory box filled with letters from friends who couldn't attend. a stack of bookmarks my students had illustrated for guests. In its place stood a champagne wall. Gold flutes gleamed behind clear acrylic panels. A sign read, "Sip before you sit," in fox calligraphy. Evelyn's voice floated behind me. "It's more modern this way, don't you think?" The personal touches felt cluttered. Cluttered. Elise placed a steady hand on my back. I didn't move. "Your mother's photo," I began. I had it wrapped. "Don't worry," Evelyn said breezily. "It's safe. But let's not make this about grief, Caroline. Today is supposed to be about joy." Joy. I swallowed hard. Did Mark know? She paused, just long enough. "He trusts me with details. I assumed you would too." That pause said everything. And suddenly, the room was colder. The bridal suite was quiet when I returned. Muted mauve curtains filtered in late morning light. Elise was fixing the last loop of my veil, her fingers gentle, eyes sharp. "I found the box," she whispered. "They stuffed it in a supply closet. I moved it back into your car." I nodded, throat too tight for thanks. Then the door creaked. Evelyn stepped in like she owned the air. A soft knock, but no pause for permission. Her eyes swept over me. Hair, makeup, dress, like she was scanning for defects. "You look rested," she said. Though I might have gone with a more sculpted foundation. Cameras are unforgiving after 40 boim. Elise stilled behind me. I didn't flinch. Evelyn walked to the vanity, picked up my lip tint. "This color's nice. But a bit casual, no?" I reached out and took it gently from her hand. "I like casual." She tilted her head. "Of course. It suits your background." The silence pulsed. I met her gaze in the mirror. "Evelyn, is there something you need?" She smoothed her blouse. "Only to make sure everything's worthy of Mark." That did it. The breath I'd been holding since breakfast exhaled. Slow, steady, cold. "You mean worthy of you." She smiled faintly. "Same thing, darling." I didn't answer. I couldn't.
Not yet.
Because the storm was gathering. And I wasn't sure which way it would turn. After Evelyn left, the door clicked softly behind her. Elise exhaled. "She's unbelievable." I stood still, my hands on the back of the velvet chair. My reflection looked composed, but my pulse beat at my throat. Then Elise tapped her phone and turned it toward me. The screen showed a live feed. From the hallway camera. The same camera we'd installed as part of the Foundation's community storytelling grant. The live stream we'd launched an hour ago for transparency, equity, and accessibility. It was still running. Elise whispered, "You never turned it off." I stared at the screen. And there I was. Standing stiff, veil half set, Evelyn's last words barely faded from the mic. I felt my stomach tighten. The realization hit like a tremor under my ribs. People were watching. Our interns, donors, volunteers, students. Strangers who'd supported us when the budget got slashed. Women who'd emailed me about burnout. Mothers who wrote, "Thanks for reminding me I still matter." They were watching. Every slice of shade, every polite cruelty dressed in pearls. Elise said, gently, "It's your call. I can end it." But I shook my head, because for the first time that morning, I saw what she was really offering. Not exposure, but truth. I sat for a moment, letting the room fall quiet again. Outside, the sound of wooden chairs scraping against stone made my shoulders tense. I imagined the clink of champagne flutes, the polite murmurs, the sharp laughter that always followed Evelyn's stories about Palm Springs or her husband's law legacy. Her perfume still lingered. Something floral but cold, like lilies in a winter vase. I stood and walked slowly to the window. Mark was there now, helping a vendor adjust the audio cable, jacket off, sleeves rolled. Always calm in chaos. Always making things work without demanding credit. I thought of that night at his father's memorial, when Evelyn made a cutting remark about some people knowing when to stay quiet. I'd bristled. Mark had looked at her and said, gently but firmly, Caroline is not someone who blends in. That's why I love her. He'd squeezed my hand then, just like I hoped he would today. I touched the glass, cool under my fingers. This wasn't the day I imagined, but maybe it could still be mine. If I wanted it loud, I could make it loud. But if I wanted it quiet and sharp, like the edge of truth, that would cut deeper. The guests were starting to arrive. From the window, I could see Mark's cousin Ellie helping her grandmother to a seat. The sound of laughter filtered through the open window. Light, distant, unaware, Evelyn reappeared in the doorway. She didn't knock this time. I just wanted to say, she began, stepping in, this will all be over soon. And once the photos are taken, the ceremony's done, it will be behind you. I turned slowly. Behind me. She smiled thinly. Yes, the nerves, the noise, the need to perform. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. This isn't your moment, Caroline. It's ours, ours. Not mine, not Mark's, not even family, hers. Control wrapped in a smile. Legacy wrapped in lace. My fingers curled against my side. And in that instant, I knew the truth. She hadn't cut the dress to ruin the wedding. She'd cut it to remind me who held the scissors. But the camera was still rolling. And I had a choice. The dress was laid out across the chaise, sunlight catching the embroidery like threads of glass. I didn't notice it at first. Not until Elise stepped back with a pin in her mouth and froze. Caroline, she said softly. I turned, expecting a loose hem, a snag, something fixable. But then I saw it. A long, clean slash down the side seam, from waist to hip. Deliberate, precise. The air left my lungs. Not torn, not snagged. Cut. Elise knelt beside it. It wasn't like this earlier. I swear. When I hung it, it was perfect. I crouched next to her, fingertips hovering just above the rip. It looked almost surgical. The lining gaped open like a quiet wound. We sat in silence. In the distance, violin music started. Prelude, guests taking their seats. I whispered, she was in here alone. Before we arrived. Elise didn't answer. She didn't have to. My stomach turned. Not from the damage, but from the message. This wasn't an accident. This was a warning. She hadn't just wanted me silent, she wanted me small. Terrible. Replaceable. And I'd almost let her. But now? Now she'd made it easy. I stood slowly, brushing my palms on my thighs. Elise was still crouched beside the chaise, blinking fast like she didn't trust her eyes. We can fix it. I can stitch it. Or maybe tape. Or pin it. Her voice was climbing now, panicked and breathless. We'll call Dana. We'll. Elise? I said quietly. She stopped. I picked up the veil, still untouched on the side table. Smoothed it flat. I don't have a backup dress, I said. More to myself than to her. She stared at me. What? I smiled, just barely. I never planned for one. I thought if something went wrong it wouldn't be this. The camera light blinked red from the corner. Still rolling, I walked toward the full-length mirror. Looked at the rip again, but this time, not as loss. As evidence. Evelyn did this because she thought I'd break, I said. But I've already broken before. That's why I know how to hold. Elise stood slowly. So what do we do? I met her eyes. We let them watch. Then I turned to the mirror, placed the veil atop my hair, and whispered, "Sue the livestream." The room downstairs was no longer quiet. From the monitor, we could see the livestream feed, still wide, angle, still clear. The guests were shifting in their seats. A few were pointing. Some were whispering. Others were reading the closed captions scrolling across the screen. One of our interns must have linked the hallway, mic to the projection screen. There I was. And there she was. Evelyn's voice echoed through the main hall. This isn't your moment. It's ours. And then silence. Sharp. Electric. I saw my old professor lean in toward a colleague. One of our board members crossed his arms slowly. A group of Foundation volunteers huddled near the back, mouths slightly parted. Elise looked at me. Should we stop it? I shook my head. We didn't start anything. Then, movement. Evelyn, elegant in dove-gray silk, swept into the vestibule. Her smile was tight, calculated. She glanced up at the projection screen, paused. Her face dropped a fraction of an inch. That was all. But I saw it. The split second where control slipped from her fingers and turned to glass. She turned on her heel and disappeared through the side corridor. And just like that, the crowd wasn't hers anymore. The lace on the sleeve brushed against my wrist like a whisper. Elise stepped back, adjusting the veil one last time. Her hands were steady again. Mine weren't. "Are you ready?" she asked. I looked in the mirror. The slash had been hidden as best it could. Elise had pinned it with surgical grace. But it was still there, a faint ripple where the fabric no longer flowed. Part of me wanted to find another dress, change locations, cancel everything. But then again, this moment was no longer about perfection. It was about reclaiming what was already mine. I nodded. Let's walk. As we opened the door, the noise outside dimmed. A hush had settled over the venue. Evelyn stood near the archway, speaking to a cluster of guests. She turned as we emerged, her expression unreadable. A cocktail of denial and calculation. I didn't look away. Each step down the hallway echoed louder than the last. My shoes tapped softly, but they felt like thunder. At the final turn, Elise paused beside me. "You've already changed everything?" she said. I reached for the handle of the ceremony doors, and in that heartbeat before they opened, I wasn't nervous. I was clear. I was choosing this entrance. Torn seam and all, the ceremony doors swung open. The sun caught on the petals lining the aisle, and the scent of rosemary and wild mint rose like memory. I stepped forward. Every head turned. There was no string quartet now, no swelling cue. Just the sound of my footsteps, measured, even, whole. The veil caught in the breeze behind me. The dress moved, flawed but beautiful. Like something lived in, not preserved. I saw Evelyn standing near the front row, her arms folded, jaw tight. She didn't sit. She didn't smile. She just watched. Frozen, unreadable, as I passed. I didn't stop. Because farther ahead, under the arbor, was Mark. His hands were folded, but when he saw me, they dropped to his sides. Open, steady. His eyes said everything. He had seen the stream, he had heard her. But he stayed. And when I reached him, I took his hand and held it, not like a bride needing rescue, but like a woman who had chosen this love with eyes wide open. Past the lace, past the lineage, past the cut. The ceremony ended with a quiet applause, not a roar. Not because the crowd wasn't supportive, but because it felt sacred. Like they had witnessed something more fragile than vows, more exposed than lace. Mark and I walked down the aisle together, hands linked, his thumb brushing mine in small, steady circles. He didn't speak, neither did I, not yet. Inside the bridal suite, the noise from the reception area was a dull hum. Glasses clinking. Someone laughing. A pop of a champagne cork. But in that room, it was still. Mark closed the door behind us and turned to face me. "I saw the screen," he said. I nodded. I heard what she said. Another nod. "She cut your dress." I looked at him. "She tried to cut me out of it." His face tightened. He crossed the room, ran a hand through his hair. Then he turned back. "My father knew." I blinked. Mark stepped closer. "He didn't do it. But he saw her come out of this room before you arrived. And he didn't stop her. The air shifted. Like the whole room tilted. You're telling me he let it happen? Mark didn't look away. I think he thought she'd stop short. Like she always does. This time, she didn't. I sat down slowly, the dress rustling under me like paper already folded too many times. Mark didn't move. I stared at the floor. At the line where the sunlight from the window met the shadow of the chair. That sharp divide. Like the one running through this family. He's always been like that, I said quietly. Mark looked up. Your father, I added. Kind. Polite. Silent. I remembered the first dinner I ever had at their house. Evelyn had corrected my place-setting mid-meal. I'd laughed, tried to brush it off. He'd smiled gently and said nothing. At the foundation gala, when Evelyn introduced me as Mark's activist fiancé, and someone nearby snickered, he'd been 10 feet away. Sipping wine. Still and quiet, always still. Until silence wasn't neutral anymore. Sometimes, I said, the people who watch and say nothing hurt you worst. Mark sat on the edge of the ottoman across from me. He's not malicious, he just folds. He's always let her lead. And you? I asked. He paused. Not anymore. It was said softly, but something in it carried weight, like a door quietly locking shut. I didn't know if it was for her. Or for him. I stood again, this time slower, the weight of the fabric and the moment pressing against my legs. The mirror hadn't moved. Neither had the slash. I walked toward it. Not to fix anything, not to check. Just to see. The pins Elise had used were holding, but barely. A slight wrinkle at the hip gave it away. The dress didn't look perfect. But I did. Not in the airbrushed, bridal, magazine way. Not polished, but present. My eyes weren't wide with awe. They were steady with something deeper. Resolve. This isn't what I imagined. I whispered. Mark stood behind me now. His reflection just over my shoulder. It's not what I wanted for you either, he said. But it's still real. I turned slightly. Is that enough? He didn't rush his answer. It is if you say it is. For a long second, I stayed still, watching myself, watching him, feeling the tension not just in the room, but in me. Was I choosing a marriage, or surviving a spectacle? I closed my eyes, and asked myself the only question that mattered. Can I belong here, without becoming invisible again? A soft knock interrupted the silence. Elise peeked in. Sorry. But someone wants a moment with you. Before I could speak, she stepped aside, and there he was. Mr. Brooks. Still in his charcoal suit, the same one he'd worn to every formal event for the last decade. He looked older than he had 2 hours ago. Shoulders slightly hunched, hands loosely clasped. May I? He asked. I nodded, unsure if my voice would hold. He stepped in, eyes flicking briefly to the veil, then to the dress. He saw the seam. The pins. But he didn't ask. I owe you an apology, he said simply. I stayed still. I saw her come out of here, he continued. I knew something wasn't right, and I told myself it wasn't mine to interfere. He swallowed. That's been my mistake for 40 years. He paused. Then added, don't let silence shape your story. Not like I did. For a long time, I said nothing. Then finally, do you believe she'll change? He exhaled, wary and honest. No. But I believe you already did. The reception wasn't loud. It wasn't festive, not in the way people expected weddings to be. It was something else, quieter. Heavier. Like a community bracing together after a storm. When Mark and I entered the ballroom, there was polite applause. But, more than that, there were glances. Not all of them were kind. Some guests smiled and nodded with quiet support. Others looked down at their napkins. Or straight through me. Like if they didn't acknowledge what happened. They wouldn't have to choose a side. The champagne wall Evelyn had installed stood awkwardly off to one corner now, untouched. Mark's cousin Ellie pulled me aside near the guestbook. "Just so you know," she whispered, "a few of us saw the feed before they turned it off." What she did. It was. She stopped, emotion rising. "You didn't deserve that. And we know it." I placed my hand on hers. "Thank you." Across the room, Mr. Brooks stood near the bar, no drink in hand, just watching. For once, not fading into the wallpaper. Mark touched my elbow. "Do you want to skip the first dance?" I looked at the room. "No," I said. "But we'll do it on our terms." And when the music played, soft and instrumental, I didn't sway like a bride. I stood still, and Mark moved around me. Quiet, steady, present. It wasn't a dance. It was a declaration. After the toast, short, unmemorable, delivered by a college friend of Mark's, I slipped away from the main room. Elise followed. We found a corner in the venue's office space, just past the caterer's prep hallway. She locked the door behind us. "Still want it?" she asked, holding up her phone. "The livestream. The entire feed, still intact," I nodded. "2 copies, one for me, one for, just in case." She connected to the drive we'd used for grant videos and uploaded the file with clinical calm. "You going to release it?" she asked. "Not yet." Because this wasn't about vengeance. Not anymore. It was about preservation. Of truth, of record, of voice. We burned copies onto a drive, labeled them plainly, one in my bag, one in hers, one I mailed, quietly, with no return name, to my old attorney. Just the initials CB, written in small marker on the corner. Just in case. "I hate that we have to do this on your wedding day," Elise said softly. I exhaled. "I don't. I think it's the perfect day." Because this wasn't about celebration anymore. This was about power. And this time, I wasn't giving it away quietly. Later that evening, just before the sun dipped below the magnolias, I found a moment alone in the reception office. Mark was outside greeting guests. Evelyn hadn't returned to the ballroom. She was, according to someone's murmured report, resting upstairs with a headache. I opened my laptop. It was still logged into the Foundation portal from earlier in the week. Our latest community grant announcement was scheduled to go out at midnight. I reread the draft headline. "Building Forward, Legacy Through Quiet Leadership." I stared at it for a while. Then I placed the cursor after the final sentence and began to type. "Real legacy doesn't pass through family trees or polished speeches. It passes through the women who speak up. When silence is expected, it lives in truth recorded, stories shared, and power reclaimed in small rooms with no applause." I didn't add my name. But I didn't need to. Anyone who'd watched the livestream, or felt the cut of a well-aimed smile, would recognize the voice. Before I hit save and schedule, I changed one more thing. I moved the press contact email from E. Brooks to my own, just in case someone needed to talk. Not to ask permission, but to begin. The message wasn't just for them. It was for the woman I used to be. The one who held her tongue at long dinners, who smoothed tension with polite smiles and held her breath through backhanded compliments. The one who thought walking away quietly was the price of grace. I left the screen open for another minute, watching the words sit still and strong on the page. Then I closed the laptop. Behind me, the last of the sunlight poured in through the high windows, draping everything in amber. I stood in the silence for a moment longer, letting it hold me. No vows playing, no speeches echoing, just a soft knowing in my chest that this time, I didn't just survive the day, I shaped it. And for every woman who's ever stood in a room built to silence her, you're not alone in it anymore. Have you ever had to protect your truth? Quietly but firmly. On a day meant to celebrate you. Tell me below. Someone might need your voice more than you think. 1 week after the wedding, Evelyn still hadn't said a word. No apology. No message. Not even a passive-aggressive forwarded article about wedding etiquette. Just silence. Which, in her world, was supposed to function as erasure. If she didn't speak of it, if she didn't name it, it hadn't happened. But this time, the silence wasn't hers to weaponize, because the livestream didn't go away. People had screen-recorded, screenshotted, whispered. Some deleted it, some saved it. But it lived, quietly, firmly, in the inboxes and group chats of those who had always suspected how Evelyn handled women like me. And now they didn't have to imagine. I didn't post it. I didn't link it. But I did one thing. I clipped a 47-second segment, her voice saying, "This isn't your moment, it's ours." And I sent it, along with a short note, to the Foundation's board of directors, in case clarity is ever questioned regarding our recent transition in communications leadership. I hope this moment speaks for itself. No accusation, no commentary. Just her words, their ears, and my silence, finally used right. By Thursday, I had already drafted the outline for a new Foundation campaign. We called it Voice After the Silence. No logos with gold leaf, no posed portraits, just stories, audio. First names only. Women from across our networks, grant recipients, volunteers, board members, sharing one moment they were told to be quiet. And what happened when they spoke anyway? It wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. Elise helped with the scripting. My former student, Lonnie, offered to direct. And we launched with a single quote on our homepage. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just refuses to disappear. Mark didn't ask for details. He didn't hover. He just watched me work, bringing me tea and plugging in my charger when I forgot. He told me, "Whatever you build, I'll build the garden around it." That was enough. By Friday, the media requests started coming in. Not about the wedding. Not directly. But about the Foundation's sudden tone shift. Someone asked if Evelyn was still involved. I gave a smile that meant everything and said, "No, she's stepped back from the public side of our work." That was true. I didn't need to explain the rest. Some silences speak louder than others. It was Elise's idea to hold the first Voice After the Silence preview in our own backyard. Not a gala. Not a donor dinner. A garden. Mark's garden. The one he'd nurtured behind the house for years. Where mint grew wild near the fence, and lavender spilled over the stone path like soft defiance. We invited 15 women. No photographers. No sponsors. Just presents. Each woman brought a single item, a photo, a scarf, a piece of writing, and shared a story about when she was told to keep it down. And what happened when she didn't? I didn't speak first. I didn't need to. But when it was my turn, I brought only one thing, a folded scrap of ivory fabric. The seam Elise had pinned still visible. No explanation. Just the cut. And every woman there understood. Evelyn wasn't invited. She didn't ask why. But she knew. That weekend, her name disappeared from the Foundation's media materials. No email was sent. No announcement made. She just faded from the page, and for the first time, so did her grip. The day after the garden gathering, I received an envelope. Handwritten. No return address. Inside was a note. "I see you've made your point. I hope you're done now." No signature. No threat. Just control repackaged as peace. I folded the note and tucked it into the same drawer where I'd kept the livestream copy. Then I opened my laptop and drafted one final letter. It wasn't public. It wasn't performative. It was a letter of resignation. For Evelyn. Effective immediately, she would hold no advisory role, honorary or otherwise, within the foundation. She had not requested it, but I granted it. Because some exits don't need permission, they need precision. I saved the draft. I would send it Monday. Not for drama. For documentation. The silence was no longer her shield. It was mine now, and in its quiet I made room. For women louder than me. For justice quieter than her. And for legacies that didn't ask permission to begin. I sent the letter at 7:04 a.m. on Monday. Not because it mattered what time, but because I didn't want it to sit in drafts anymore. The subject line was simple: Board Update Communications Realignment. Inside was a one-page PDF, professional, firm, and dated. It stated that Evelyn Brooks, effective immediately, would hold no advisory, ceremonial, or informal role at the Foundation. That no quotes, images, or representations of her should appear in materials unless legally required. That any inquiries about the transition would be handled by the Director of Programs. Me. No flourish. No flourish was needed. What followed wasn't fireworks, it was ripples. At 9:13 a.m., one board member replied, "Received and noted. Long overdue." At 9:21, another, "Proud to be part of this next chapter." Then, at 9:37, came the pause. From Margaret Wetlow, one of Evelyn's oldest allies on the board. Her message read, "I understand the concerns, but Evelyn has dedicated 2 decades to this foundation. Is there truly no path toward reconciliation?" I stared at the screen for a moment. Then I typed, "She had one. And she used it to cut through a wedding dress." I hit send. And for the first time since the wedding, I leaned back, not in defense, but in clarity. The quarterly board meeting took place on Thursday. Same room. Same coffee. Same agenda template. But one seat stayed empty. Evelyn's. No one said it aloud. But we all saw it. I opened the meeting with the campaign update. Elise presented early results from Voice after the silence. Engagement was 5 times higher than projections. Halfway through the agenda, Margaret Wetlow raised her hand. "I still believe Evelyn's removal was abrupt," she said. "She helped shape this foundation." I looked at her. Calm. "And I believe we're finally reflecting the voices we claim to serve." Margaret's eyes narrowed, but she didn't push further. Because before she could, someone else spoke. It wasn't a board member. It was Nora, a community organizer from our Atlanta grantee network, there to present a project. "I'm sorry," she said, turning slightly. "But may I?" We nodded. She held up her phone and played 10 seconds from the livestream. Evelyn's voice, sharp and unmistakable. "This isn't your moment. It's ours." Silence filled the room. Then Nora added, "I've heard those words before, from people who claim to uplift us." She didn't need to say more. Margaret lowered her gaze. The meeting continued, and Evelyn's seat, it stayed empty. Physically, symbolically, permanently. That evening, as I poured tea in the quiet of our kitchen, my phone buzzed. One message. From a number I hadn't saved but recognized. Henry Brooks. Just 2 lines. I saw the agenda. "You did the right thing." Then, a pause. Another message followed. "She never understood legacy. But you do." I stared at the screen. Not because I needed his validation, but because I knew what it cost him to send that. Henry had spent a lifetime behind a woman who rarely let anyone else be visible. And now, he was stepping forward. Not loud, not public, but real. I replied simply, "Thank you. I hope you're okay." He responded, "For the first time in years, I think I will be." Mark came in behind me, wrapped his arms gently around my waist, his voice low against my shoulder. "Was that him?" I nodded. "He said I did the right thing." Mark didn't speak. He didn't need to. His hands squeezed just slightly. His breath slowed in sync with mine. And for the first time since I stepped into that dressing room, I felt still. Not because everything was over, but because the tide had turned, and I was no longer standing against it. I was standing in it, on my own feet. 2 weeks later, the foundation held its annual fall gathering. Same city, new venue, different tone. This time, it was held at the local Women's Entrepreneurship Center, a converted warehouse full of open light and reclaimed wood. No velvet ropes, no seating chart with gold calligraphy. Just folding chairs, a projector, and the sound of voices rising. Real ones. I arrived early. Not to oversee, just to witness. As the room filled, I caught eyes with a dozen women I'd met only through grant calls and shared outrage. We smiled, not with politeness, with knowing. The program began. Elise introduced the speakers. Nora read a spoken word piece. Lonnie debuted the first trailer from Voice After the Silence. Each woman stood, unapologetic, whole, and in the back row I saw an empty seat, not reserved, not even noticed, but its absence pulsed louder than any presence. Evelyn didn't come. She wasn't barred. No one stopped her. She simply wasn't part of this anymore. And that truth didn't need microphones. It needed space. 1 year later, the garden had grown. Lavender lined the entire east fence now, wild and intentional. Mark's tomatoes were taking over the raised beds. And the mint, still unruly, but no longer unwelcome. I'd stepped back from day-to-day operations at the foundation, but Voice After the Silence had become part of its core programming. A standing exhibit, a curriculum, a reminder. Some stories were now required listening for incoming board members. Elise had taken over the campaign full-time. Lonnie had been hired to produce the next series. I focused on one project at a time. Grant mentoring. Occasional workshops. A few long walks with women who didn't need advice. Just space. The video from our wedding still floated quietly across corners of the internet. Not viral, not loud, but it had reached the people who needed it. A few months ago, I received a handwritten note from a 26-year-old in Colorado. She wrote, "I saw the live stream the week I was supposed to get married." His mother wasn't as obvious, but her grip was just as strong. "Your silence gave me permission to choose something else." There was no return address. Only a pressed dogwood flower folded inside. Mark found me that morning, still holding the letter, tears quietly threading down my cheek. I looked up at him and said, "She got out." He nodded, arms around my back. That's legacy. Last month, I was asked to speak at a leadership retreat for women rebuilding after separation and loss. I said yes, but requested one thing: no introductions, no bios, just, "Here's Caroline." The room held maybe 30 folding chairs and a coffee station that kept running out of cream. But I've never felt more seen. I didn't talk about Evelyn. I didn't talk about the dress. I talked about the day I realized silence wasn't passive. It could be active, exact, and unflinching. That legacy doesn't always announce itself in applause. Sometimes, it's a quiet voice saying, "Not this time." And standing in that room, I didn't hand out answers. I handed out blank cards. Each woman was invited to write the one sentence she wished someone had said to her. The year everything cracked open. We hung them on a wire near the window. Some were shaky. Some were bold. All of them were true. One card simply said, "I didn't ruin the day. I revealed it." And someone else had drawn a phoenix beneath it. Rising, soft and scarred, but still rising. At the end, I didn't ask them to be louder. I asked them to be deliberate. And when I stepped outside, the wind was soft. It carried no applause. Just breath, and that was enough. The garden's still growing. So am I. And maybe that's the only legacy worth leaving. Not perfection, not control. Just a space where someone else can stand, breathe, and say, "This time, I choose differently." So if you're out there, still holding your breath in rooms too quiet, still stitching yourself back together, know this: you are not alone. And you are not too late to begin again. Where are you listening from? Has silence ever been your strength? Tell me below. Your story might be the hand someone else needs to reach for. Subscribe to EN Ready DITSTORY for more true stories of justice, healing, and quiet power after 40. Because legacy isn't always loud, but it always echoes.